My name is Elena Brooks, and I never wanted to marry into wealth. I never dreamed of mansions or designer dresses. All I wanted was peace, maybe a small life filled with honesty and love. But life has a wicked sense of humor. It gave me love, and then threw me into the lion's den. I grew up in a small town, raised by a mother who cleaned offices for a living. We didn't have much, but we had dignity. She always told me, "Elena, people may look down on you, but never bow your head to them." I believed her. I lived by that. And that belief led me to Michael Carter, a man I once thought was my home. Michael wasn't like the wealthy people I'd seen on TV. He was quiet, thoughtful, brilliant. He ran his own real estate investment firm and volunteered at shelters. I met him during a charity event I catered at. Me serving drinks, him signing $1 million checks. We fell in love slowly, genuinely. We got married quietly. And then I met his family. The Carters weren't just rich. They were old money, the kind of wealth that thinks it owns people. The kind that smiles at you while calculating your worth. From the moment I stepped into their mansion, I felt it. The judgment, the disgust, the quiet humiliation. Michael's mother, Victoria Carter, shook my hand and said, "Oh, you're lovely. Michael says you're a simple girl." Simple. Not educated. Not wealthy. Not one of us. His sister, Camilla, didn't bother hiding her smirk. His brother, Adrian, looked at me like I was a stain on their marble floors. But I smiled. I held my head up. Because love was supposed to be stronger than class. Right. I didn't know it then. But marrying Michael didn't make me part of their family. It made me their target. I thought the worst they would do was ignore me. But I underestimated wealthy cruelty. The humiliation didn't come loudly. At least, not at first. It came hidden beneath smiles. It came dressed as polite insults. It started during dinners at the Carter mansion. Victoria would look at my dress and say things like, "Elena, darling, you don't need to keep wearing the same outfits. I'll send you a stylist. You desperately need one." Camilla would laugh loudly whenever I spoke about my childhood. To her, growing up poor was comedy. Adrian would ask questions like, "So, do people in your area even go to college? What's it like not having investments? Does your mother still clean for a living?" Every time I answered, I felt my dignity bleed a little. "Michael." He said nothing. He would hold my hand under the table, but he never defended me. He always told me, "Elena, please don't make trouble. They'll get used to you." One afternoon, Victoria called me into her study, without Michael. She sat behind a massive desk like a judge ready to pass a sentence. "Elena," she said, "now that you're a Carter, we need to help you adapt. We don't want you embarrassed by your lack of financial experience." I frowned. "I'm doing just fine." She slid a document toward me. A prenup, dated after I was already married. "For the protection of the family," she said with a thin smile. "Sign it, or you will force Michael to choose between you and his blood." But that was a lie. They never got used to me. They only got bolder. I stared at her. She wasn't offering me security. She was giving me a warning. "You will never belong here." I didn't sign it. That day, Victoria declared a silent war against me, turning me into a servant. Every week, she found a new way to put me in my place. Guests would visit, and I would mysteriously end up serving drinks while Camilla sat beside Michael, acting like his real partner. I became decoration, seen but not heard. I wasn't a wife. I was a maid with a wedding ring. One night, during a large Carter Foundation gala, I walked into the dining hall and froze. On a massive digital screen, they were showing a slideshow about Michael's journey. Pictures of his childhood, his college years, his business empire, his future legacy. And beside him, in picture after picture, was not me. It was Camilla. Victoria stood at the podium and said proudly, "Family comes before everything. Partnerships must be equal, not charity. Our legacy must be protected." Some of the guests glanced at me with pity. Some smirked. Some whispered behind their champagne glasses. I felt like I was drowning. I stepped outside to breathe. My heart was breaking. Then I heard them, Victoria and Camilla, standing just around the corner. Camilla laughed. He'll eventually divorce her. She doesn't belong here. Victoria replied. She won't last. Poor girls don't fight back. She will leave quietly. Well, I would not leave quietly. They thought they knew me. They thought poverty was weakness. They forgot something. Kind doesn't mean weak. And silence doesn't mean surrender. That night, I made a decision. I would not cry. I would not beg. I would not run. I would study them. And when the time was right, I would bring their empire to its knees. They kept pushing. Tiny cuts. Small humiliations that added up until I was no longer a wife in my own home. I was a showpiece, a soft laugh at family dinners, someone to be reshaped and discarded at their convenience. One evening, Michael and I argued in our bedroom. Not loudly. There was never loud anger in our house, only a cold, rotting quiet. He said things that sounded like care but felt like submission. Elena, please. These things are complicated. You don't want to make waves. The family. It's tradition. I remember looking at him and seeing the man I'd married shrink into the son they'd raised. My hands shook. I wanted to tell him how degrading it felt to be used as furniture in his mother's life. I wanted to ask him to choose me. I didn't. Because he didn't know how. Then the real cruelty started. It was small at first. A missing invitation here, an excluded photo there. But the Carters are architects of reputation. They know how to make social erasure look like etiquette. At a summer charity brunch, the one Michael had asked me to host, I found my place at a side table behind a potted plant, while the Carters' other guests mingled under crystal chandeliers. My face was warm from the heat. My hands held the teacup too tight. That afternoon, beneath the polite toasts and the fake smiles, a cruel plan was set in motion. Camilla slipped away, placed a folded note in Victoria's palm. Victoria smiled, turned, and announced to the room. We have decided to move forward with our next phase. Michael's partner will not be represented on this venture. It's simply not appropriate. There was polite applause, the kind that sounds like knives. I felt my world tilt. Michael's hand found mine, but only in the way someone holds a souvenir, not a person. Later that night, I discovered the final humiliation. Victoria had arranged a family council. They called it concern. They called it for Michael's legacy. They called me too many things. All of them words that told me I was the problem. They presented me with yet another paper. This one was labeled family terms. It was a thinly veiled eviction disguised as care. It read like this: step away from public responsibilities, defer all major decisions, and agree to a grace period, while the family assessed what was best for the enterprise. Or sign and be quietly removed. I walked home in the rain that night, the pages soaked and useless in my hands. For the first time since my mother died, I thought I might be better off alone. I cried until my cheeks were raw. I sat down and let the storm outside match the one inside. But then, in the way grief sometimes steals you, something inside me sharpened. Not anger at first. Not revenge. Just a very quiet clarity. If they're going to treat me like a disposable piece of furniture, I will stop being the kind of furniture they can throw away. I started to pay attention in ways I hadn't before. When I had been kind and soft, I assumed kindness would protect me. I didn't realize kindness could also be camouflage. While I was waiting at the kitchen counter with a warm smile, I watched the family move, took notes, listened, and then I found the first crack. It was a late-night email. I should not have had access to it, but Victoria was careless with her laptop once. She'd left it unlocked in the drawing room after one of her soirees. I walked past for tea and on impulse, glanced at the screen. There it was, a spreadsheet with red numbers. A line item that didn't add up. A series of transfers to an offshore account tied to a shell company with a name I recognized. The name of a supplier that had suddenly started giving discounted invoices to the Carters. Copied the reference. I bookmarked it in my head. I went to bed pretending sleep could make the noise stop. The next day I started looking for patterns. The Carters' empire wasn't some invincible monolith. It was a house of cards held together by relationships. Exclusive suppliers, preferred contractors, a small circle of investors who trusted the family name more than the numbers. And where there's reliance, there's vulnerability. I also noticed something else, the one thing no one expected from someone like me. While they dismissed my upbringing, I'd spent years watching and helping my mother run a small, efficient business. We had managed suppliers with little money, negotiated favors, and turned scraps into inventory. I learned thrift and creative sourcing. I knew how to find value when everyone else chased prestige. It's funny. The things they used to mock were exactly what would save me. I started to quietly rebuild the small network I'd once had. Old catering clients. The woman at the dry cleaners who knew an honest supplier. A local lab technician who did contract work on weekends. People I had once helped in exchange for favors. I called them, not because I needed pity, but because I needed truth. Slowly a map formed. Where the Carters depended on luxury suppliers, I found alternatives. Where they relied on cheap loyalty, I found people willing to work with real terms. I started compiling evidence, but not the sort of evidence that makes for courtroom drama. This was operational intelligence. Contract dates, invoices, timelines, who benefited from which transfers. And then a second discovery landed like a blow. I was going through archived boxes in a guest room, remnants of Michael's grandfather's old files, when I found a folder labeled Carter Holdings, Contingency. Inside were emails and memos that nobody bothered to lock away. One message stood out. A message chain between Victoria and an external consultant about a risky development project far outside the family's stated portfolio. The consultant wrote in cold corporate language that the firm was over-leveraged, and that unless they secured a new funding line within 90 days, the bank would call the loan. If you're listening carefully, you'll notice how small families can make big mistakes. Wealth sometimes breeds complacency. Complacency invites debt. Debt invites panic. This was panic. Now I had something nobody could easily ignore. Hard numbers tied to imminent failure. If the banks called their loan, the Carters' cash flow would freeze. Investors would withdraw. Suppliers would cut them off. The mansion would still be there, but the value underneath would bleed. It was ugly. It was dangerous. It was the perfect desperation for me to exploit, not through malice but through skill. But there was a problem. I had no title, no authority, and no credit. I had been taught to be soft, to give, not to take. The family would never accept me as the savior. In their eyes I was still the girl with tired hands. So I chose something else. I began to gather allies inside the house. Not the Carters, not yet. I started with the household staff. The longtime house manager who watched transactions come and go, the head of procurement who had been silently undermined by new suggestions, and even a junior financial analyst who'd been marginalized. I whispered to them about the numbers and the timeline. I listened to their fears. I offered a plan not as a revolt, but as a solution that would preserve jobs if done honestly. They listened. And in the whisper network of service and truth, they handed me more documents. Invoices with mismatched amounts, shipping manifests that showed phantom shipments, emails that matched the offshore transfers to the consultant's emergency funding. At night, by the kitchen light, I compiled everything into a single file. Map of risk. A dossier not meant to shame but to save. Only save who? Them. Myself. I remember the smell of the coffee and the metal edge of the stapler as I clipped pages together. I felt small and enormous at once. It felt like the first honest thing I'd done in months. On the day I finally presented my findings, I didn't speak to Victoria or Camilla. I went directly to Michael. He looked at me across his oak desk as I laid the papers in front of him. The trend lines, the imminent call on the loan, the offshores, the vendor discrepancies. "You must stop this," I said, voice modest but steady. "You need help. Can fix this. Not by hiding what's gone wrong, but by rebuilding it properly. Starting with the operations. I know how to do this without roping creditors into more lies. He stared at me for a long time. In his eyes, I could see the fracture between what he owed his blood and what his heart wanted. Then he asked the question I'd been dreading. Why would you care, Elena? After everything. I felt everything in me split open. For a moment I almost told him the truth. That they'd crushed me, humiliated me, made me disappear. But the truth wouldn't save us. My plan would. Because I love you, I said simply. And because if this empire collapses, a lot of people will lose their homes. He nodded slowly, as if a chain had been unlatched. Michael agreed to let me try, but only unofficially. I would work behind the scenes, unpaid, with a few trusted staff. I would not be on the company letterhead. I would not be seen in their boardroom. This was their condition. Accepted. Not because I longed to be seen. Not because I wanted thanks. But because I saw an opening. A way to use what they had taught me in cruelty and turn it into leverage. And when you have leverage, you have power. The file sat in my bag as I walked back to the mansion that night. The rain had stopped. The lights on the avenue blurred into streaks. I felt the smallest ember of something dangerous and bright. Not hatred exactly. More like a clear plan. I would step into their world on their terms. I would clean their books, stitch the holes they'd left, and make the empire stable again. Only then, when I had rebuilt what they thought they owned, would I ask for what I truly deserved. What I did next would make everyone in that house realize that kindness can be a weapon, and that people who are simple sometimes know things the rich never learn. I stepped into the role they gave me, the invisible fixer, like slipping into a uniform that didn't belong to me. I answered to no title. I walked halls as the woman who does the work no one sees. And while they looked down, I did the only thing that ever felt like faith to me. I got to work. My nights became spreadsheets and whispered meetings. By day I scrubbed numbers. By night I negotiated with vendors. I called old contacts from my catering days, the ones who understood how to stretch credit without compromising quality. I arranged emergency shipments from small, honest suppliers and rerouted inventory so clients wouldn't notice the gaps. I taught the housekeeper to reconcile petty ledgers and the procurement assistant how to flag phantom invoices. It was tedious. It was humble. It was effective. People who had always assumed I was soft started bringing me problems. A supplier threatening to cut them off, a payroll error that could ignite scandal, a partner quietly siphoning funds. I fixed each problem with a calm that surprised even me. It wasn't dramatic. It was relentless. Michael watched me work. Sometimes he stayed late and sat with his coffee while I recalculated cash flows on his kitchen table. He would ask questions, small ones, and I would answer. Gradually, his hand found mine without fear of orders from the room next door. I could see him wrestling with something in his chest, loyalty to his family or to the woman who just saved them. Then came the first public test. The bank called in a routine review, citing anomalies in the ledger. If we failed, they could freeze lines of credit and trigger a collapse. I volunteered to be the point person on payroll reconciliation. No fanfare. No announcement. I simply presented corrected statements, renegotiated short-term terms with a supplier I'd convinced to be patient, and arranged a bridge financing option through one of my modest contacts, an investor who believed in honest work over mere names. It wasn't glamorous. It didn't make for dinner conversation. But for the first time, I heard the word in hushed tones that had never been said in the mansion before. Respect. But respect in the Carter house was dangerous. It made the jealous sharpen their knives. Camilla noticed subtle shifts. The way staff deferred to me. The way a procurement decision quietly passed through me. Victoria, who liked to think she controlled every current in the river, began to eye my choices as if they were trespasses. That's when the silent counterattacks began. Small things at first. A supplier losing a shipment to an alternate address. An invoice presented with a different unit price. Then, a senior investor called a sudden private meeting and hinted that outsiders were making operational changes without board approval. I began to feel the walls close in, But instead of panic, I felt focus. I had built a dossier in my bag, a small, methodical book of dates, emails, wire traces, and supplier confirmations. But I lacked the muscle to use it as a weapon. For that, I needed leverage. And leverage, in the world of the wealthy, often comes with names. Trust funds, minority shares, quiet creditors, and old men who remembered how the family once paid their debts. So I used what I had: relationships. The head housekeeper introduced me to a former supplier of the Carters who had been quietly squeezed out last year. He agreed to meet me in the city with documents proving preferential kickbacks had been paid. A junior analyst who had been marginalized by Victoria came forward and showed me internal memos where Victoria had authorized off-the-record transfers. The small voices in the mansion, ignored, unseen, became the chorus that told the truth. I offered a plan to Michael that felt like walking a tightrope. I would continue rebuilding operations, but I would also make sure the family's vulnerabilities could be exposed. Carefully, legally, and only if they chose to keep betraying me. He nodded with a look of pain and resolve and said, "Do it. But quietly. I don't want a scene." Quiet was my playing field. I began to plant small changes that reshaped perception. Where they expected deference, I began to suggest independent audits and transparent supplier reviews, terms that sounded noble and reasonable. Victoria framed them as modern governance. The board, relieved at the appearance of fiscal discipline, agreed. They did not realize that the independent auditors I suggested had been recommended by people I'd helped in the past, people who owed me honesty and were not beholden to the family name. When the auditors arrived, they found the same cracks I'd been cataloging for months. They found offshore transfers that traced back to shell accounts. They found a pattern of vendor replacements at inflated costs. They found memos with signatures that didn't match internal timelines. The evidence didn't destroy. It revealed. It let the house see its own sickness. And when the house began to look inside itself, panic spread like a fever. The board demanded immediate transparency. An emergency meeting was called, and for the first time the Carters could not simply wave away the problem with a smile. In that meeting I sat quietly in the back. Victoria spoke with cold outrage, blaming a rogue analyst and internal confusion. Camilla stood by her mother, eyes hard. Michael listened, pained. Then, slowly I stepped forward. I handed the lead auditor an envelope. It contained the chain of emails, the ledger notes, and the supplier's contracts that linked the shell accounts. There was a hush as the room realized that the person who'd been dismissed as simple had compiled the case they were now forced to confront. My voice was soft when I spoke. That is a trick. Softness commands people to listen because it's not dramatic, it's true. I didn't do this for control. I did this to save people their jobs. To protect the people who have worked here for decades. I will continue to help. But I will not let lies be tolerated. It was not a demand. It was a contract. And in that room, words carry the weight of actions. The auditors recommended a temporary freeze on certain disbursements pending forensic review. The bank put a watch on suspicious accounts. Board members who'd been complacent now faced hard questions. The Carters felt the ground slip. Victoria's mask faltered in private. I could see her calculations shift into desperation. Camilla snapped at staff in private and made thinly veiled threats. But Michael looked at me with something like wonder and sorrow. He saw me as someone who could navigate a storm his family had caused. With leverage secured, I began the next phase of my plan. Negotiation. I was not interested in breaking the family. I wanted my dignity restored and a future where my voice mattered. I proposed a simple idea to Michael in hushed tones: restructure vendor contracts, honestly, under my supervision, and create a new operations oversight committee that reported to a neutral trustee. Put another way, make me the person in charge of fixing the holes officially. It was audacious. It was risky. It was, I realized, the only way to ensure I wouldn't be pushed out again. Michael took it to the board with tremulous confidence. There was resistance. Victoria balked. Camilla accused me of staging a coup. But the auditors and the bank, now watching closely, backed structural change. The board, fearing collapse, voted to appoint an interim operations director, someone who could implement transparent controls. And somehow, against the odds, the role was mine. I walked into my new office not as a decoration, but with keys. Not as a temporary face, but with authority. I had no title at first, but the keys change things. Keys unlock doors, access, and ledgers. Keys mean you can choose who answers your calls. Now that I had the role, I did something very deliberate. Cleaned. I removed the phantom vendors. I replaced them with honest suppliers who delivered quality at a fraction of the inflated costs. I renegotiated contracts to include transparency clauses and public accountability. I documented every single supplier change, every signed invoice, and every communication. I knew from the beginning that the only way to make the house understand that I was not a charity case was to make the improvements visible, undeniable, and profitable. The profits returned. Payroll stabilized. Investors murmured in approval. The very people who'd mocked my background now pointed to the numbers and made approving noises, like dogs wagging at a bone they did not understand they'd missed. But I kept my tone quiet. I let the work speak. Yet I knew the most powerful moment would not be numbers. It would be ethics. So I put a clause in every new contract. Full disclosure on transfers and third-party audits. If Victoria or Camilla wanted to continue their secret channels, they could not do it under the new governance. Every secret now carried a risk of exposure. And then I made the last move that changed everything. I approached one of the board's longest-serving trustees privately. He was a man who believed in the legacy of the Carters but feared their recklessness. I presented to him an offer. Stabilize the business under honest stewardship, with a plan to pay down debt and ensure long-term growth. Or watch the firm bleed and possibly be taken over by creditors who cared nothing for the legacy. People who would sell the land and the name without sentiment. It was blunt. It was true. He chose the plan. And with his influence, the board finally agreed to formalize the governance changes. Victoria seethed. She felt the house slip from her grasp. Camilla raged in private. Michael breathed for the first time in months. I had fixed their mess. I had saved their empire. But I had not done it for applause. I had done it because I needed leverage, not to break them but to change my place in the world. When the public reports finally came out, a neutral press release about governance changes and a new operations director, the world read a different story. Not of a broken marriage, but of corporate rescue. The headlines credited the operations overhaul to a quiet, brilliant hand. They did not name me in the headline. They did not have to. People at the company told the truth in whispers. And truth travels. In private, I sat across from Victoria after a long board session. She looked smaller than the marble palaces. She said nothing at first. Then, with a thin voice, she asked, "What do you want, Elena?" It was the question I had been waiting for, one I had imagined in a dozen different versions. I could have asked for money. I could have demanded apology. I could have sought public humiliation. Instead, I answered in a way that cut deeper than any public shaming. I want the same thing you always had, the ability to be heard. I want my role formalized. I want dignity. I want a title and a seat at the table where decisions are made. I want the right to protect what I've rebuilt. She laughed at first, then paused. The laugh sounds turned brittle in the air. "A title," she said. "You. A title." "Yes," I replied. "And a clause in the charter that prevents unilateral financial maneuvers without oversight. And Victoria, if anything like those offshore transfers ever happens again, I will take it public." She looked at me like she was seeing a stranger, someone who had quietly hardened into a kind of force she had not predicted. That night, as I lay in bed, Michael beside me and the house quiet, I realized something complicated. I had won a place at the table not by demanding it, but by making myself indispensable. I had used my humility as camouflage and my kindness as leverage. I had become the kind of person who can do hard things quietly. But the story doesn't end with a seat. It ends with a choice. Because power in that house would still be dangerous, and people who felt disempowered do desperate things. I had secured leverage, yes. I had a formal role, yes. But there were still secrets that could undo everything. Conversations that would have to be handled with care, and people who would not forgive. Now I know I was no longer the same soft woman who first walked into their mansion. Can fix things. Can rebuild. I can make their empire honest. But I also knew, and this is important, that I would not be content until the people who had mocked me felt the consequence of their choices. I had the keys, the numbers, and the leverage. What I would do with them would determine everything. When you finally have leverage, people notice. When numbers change, whispers become headlines. When a person who was once unseen starts to be the reason people keep their jobs, the house shifts, creaks, trembles, and then it moves. Had the role. Had the keys. I had the auditors and trustees on my side. But change in a house built on pedigree is not painless. Power invites a response. And the Carters were finally awake. Music. Low-tension strings. Patient, gathering strength. The first public crack wasn't a grand reveal. It was a neutral press release. Corporate governance changes implemented to strengthen fiscal transparency following independent audit. The headline was sober, nothing sensational, but underneath it, the story read like a slow, deliberate unraveling. Journalists called. Industry blogs dug. People who'd been too polite to ask questions began to ask. Victoria's face on television that week was different than the marble portrait in the foyer. She had the pallor of someone realizing her control had eroded. Camilla texted in sharp fragments and then stopped replying. Kept working. I cleaned contracts, enforced oversight, and replaced phantom vendors with honest partners who delivered quality and invoices that made sense. The firm stabilized. Employees stopped sleeping with the light on. People who had been nervous came back to the office with slightly straighter posture. But some things didn't mend with numbers. Trust, once broken, doesn't simply reappear on a balance sheet. One evening after a long board session, Michael met me in the kitchen. He looked tired in a way I recognized, like someone who had watched a house of cards wobble and finally decided which card to pluck. They're blaming me, he said quietly. They say I was naive. They say I should have known. He wasn't asking for forgiveness. He was offering an apology in the way a man who learned late in life can. Clumsy, sincere, and small. I let him speak. He told me how he had been trapped between loyalty and truth, how he had been taught to avoid confrontation, to keep the family image intact at all costs. He admitted that he hadn't protected me the way he should have. Hearing it hurt, but it was also a step. He had finally named it out loud. I should have fought for you, he said. I let them treat you like less. I held his hand, not because his words fixed anything, but because tenderness matters in the quiet places no headline reaches. We were not healed, but we had a moment of honesty. Publicly, the pressure continued. A coalition of former suppliers and a few investigative journalists began to ask harder questions. Word leaked about offshore transfers and preferential contracts. The board's discomfort turned to action. People who had once nodded politely now had to sign statements and face auditors. And then came the conversation I had been preparing for, the one with Victoria. She requested a private meeting under the guise of reconciliation. The room smelled faintly of citrus and old leather. She sat upright, all composure, and asked about my plans moving forward. Her voice carried the same authority she'd used to direct balls and banquets, but now it was thin. I had rehearsed this in my head 1,000 times. Revenge had never been what I wanted. I wanted dignity, agency, and a life where my work mattered. I wanted my mother's lessons honored. I wanted safety for those who relied on the company beyond their bloodline. What do you want? Victoria asked, as though the question was mine to consider humbly. I paused, tasting words that had been honed over months of quiet work. You already know, I replied. Transparency. Seat at the table. Contracts that protect workers, not just the wealthy. And an apology, not for show, but for acknowledging harm. Her eyes hardened. Apologies mean little, she said. Actions matter. If you're as effective as you claim, we'll measure you by results. So we measured. We proposed a public plan, an independent oversight committee, codified procurement rules, supplier audits, and staff protections. These were practical, boring things, the kind that save jobs but do not make good gossip. The board signed. The bank relaxed its hold. The company's credit rating stopped flirting with disaster. And then something else happened that was quieter but, to me, more consequential. I began to notice small gestures changing in the house. The housekeeper left me a tray of warm lemon cookies in the morning. A junior accountant lingered by my desk to ask a simple question about career training. A manufacturing team asked if we could institute a supplier's fair that would give smaller vendors opportunities to bid fairly. It was the soft kind of victory you don't get coverage for. People who had been seen as disposable now being treated like stakeholders. Yet the faint comforts were incomplete without a final accounting. The auditors found enough evidence to trigger an internal recovery process. The trustee I'd quietly aligned with proposed a settlement engineered to repair the financial damage and to ensure punitive measures for actors who had knowingly funneled funds away. It wasn't about vengeance. It was about accountability. Legally, the house had to act. Contracts were renegotiated. Several high-level staff who had profited from the phantom vendors were dismissed or sanctioned. Some quietly repaid funds. Others were prosecuted or faced civil suits. The news cycle called it a corporate scandal, but for the employees who had once been afraid to buy groceries, it was restoration. Camilla's social circle thinned. Her events were less frequented. Without the sheen of untethered access, her influence diminished. She tried to lash out in the press with thin statements, but the credibility she'd once enjoyed had been quietly replaced with skepticism. The day the settlement was announced, I stood at a small table in the office with a handful of employees who had been my quiet allies. We signed the Employee Protection Fund into being, a fund to secure payroll and medical benefits for those who needed it most. I thought of my mother and how she had always found ways to help others even in small ways. Sharing a recipe, letting someone cut in line, leaving spare change for someone on a bad day. In a strange twist of fate, the thing the Carters had once used to ridicule me. My experience of living modestly, negotiating with small-time suppliers, building relationships on trust rather than name, became the method that saved their empire. The irony was so complete that sometimes I laughed until I cried. As for Victoria and Camilla, the public record followed them. Victoria retired from the board with a carefully worded statement about spending more time with family and reflecting on personal priorities. Camilla retreated to a social life that was smaller and less luminous. I did not celebrate their retreats. It felt nothing like triumph. The hollowness of what they'd lost didn't fill the emptiness in me with joy. The point had never been to watch them fall. What I wanted, what I had quietly fought for, was the right to live with dignity in a home I had tried to keep intact. I wanted the ability to build without being mocked. I wanted the power to change systems that allowed cruelty to flourish. There was one final scene that mattered to me more than any legal victory. The day a mother from one of our factories wrote me a letter. She thanked the company for stabilizing wages and for the medical fund that had helped her son through an emergency. She wrote about how the small stipend had kept her from choosing between food and medication and how, for the first time in years, she felt safe. That letter sat in my drawer like a medal. It reminded me why I had first stepped into the shadows of the family. Not to take but to protect. Not to revenge but to repair. There was a conversation I never had to force. Michael and I talked one night on the balcony while the city was quiet, the lights like small promises. He said simply, "You were always stronger than I understood. You just wore it softly." I smiled, feeling the truth of that. Softness had been my way of seeing people as better than they were. Had not failed me. It had been a strategy I'd hidden until I needed its advantage. In the end, I kept my dignity. Kept my job. I kept the marriage, though not in the same shape as it began. The Carters kept their name, but with new checks and measures to keep it honest. The house was quieter now, not because victory had proven them small, but because what had once been hidden had been made visible. If you ask me what revenge looked like, I would tell you it didn't look like ruin. It looked like repair. It looked like making sure the people who had been ignored had a voice and a paycheck. It looked like turning humiliation into a platform for change. When I walk through the mansion now, sometimes people nod at me differently. Not with pity. Not with sneers. Just with acknowledgement. That's all I ever wanted. Acknowledgement that I counted. And if you take one thing from my story, let it be this. Kindness is not the same as weakness. Quiet work is not the same as surrender. And when you are pushed into a corner, the best revenge might be the one that brings others back to safety. A year later, the Operations Fellowship had funded 2 young managers. The Employee Protection Fund had helped 3 families through emergency medical crises. Michael and I hosted a small dinner for employees and their families to celebrate the new governance model. Casual, heartfelt, and messy in the best possible way. Victoria watched from a distance but did not attend. She had her pride, I had my people. If this story spoke to you, if you've ever been dismissed, humiliated, or underestimated, tell me in the comments. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that quiet strength can be everything. Subscribe for more stories of betrayal, comeback, and the power of dignity.